I never planned on staying in the cabin that night. It wasn't mine, and I had no real business being there. It belonged to a man named Leonard, a guy my dad had known for years. A family friend, but not the type we were close to. More like someone you saw once in a while and nodded at out of respect. He was an old-school woodsman, a hunter, a man who lived off the land more than he did off any job. His cabin sat deep in the forest, far from the nearest road, tucked away in a clearing where barely anyone went unless they had a reason to. I hadn't spoken to him in years. Last I heard, he was getting too old to maintain the place and was thinking of selling it. But when my dad passed, I found out Leonard had left the cabin to him in some sort of informal agreement. No official will, nothing legal, just the kind of thing old men do, trusting a handshake more than paperwork. And now, since my dad was gone, it fell to me. I didn't want it. I wasn't the type to live out in the woods, cutting firewood and hunting deer. I barely even camped, but something about letting it sit out there, alone and forgotten, bothered me. So, I decided to drive up one weekend and take a look. Maybe I'd fix a few things, make sure it wasn't falling apart, and then figure out what to do with it. It was late October, and the drive took longer than expected. The road leading into the woods was worse than I remembered. Deep potholes, overgrown brush scraping against my truck. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place was exactly as I remembered. A small wooden structure, weathered and gray, with a slanted tin roof and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The front door was locked, but the key was still hidden in the same spot under a loose plank on the porch. When I stepped inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and dust. I spent the next hour checking the place over. The roof didn't leak, which was a relief. The walls were solid. A few mice had found their way inside, judging by the droppings in the corners, but nothing too bad. The wood stove was still intact, the firewood stacked neatly beside it. I had planned on leaving before dark, but time slipped away from me. The sun was gone before I even realized it, and I wasn't in the mood to drive back down that terrible road at night. The idea of staying in the cabin alone didn't exactly sit right with me, but it was better than wrecking my truck trying to get out in the dark. I lit the old kerosene lamp on the table, started a small fire in the stove, and sat down on the creaky wooden chair near the window. The forest outside was silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. No wind,
No distant howls.
just stillness. After eating a sandwich I had packed, I settled in for the night. I wasn't tired, not really, but there wasn't much else to do. There was no electricity, no cell service. Just me, the flickering lamp, and the old wooden walls surrounding me. That's when I heard it. A soft crunch outside. A footstep. I froze, listening. It wasn't an animal. I knew the sound of a deer stepping through the brush, the way small creatures moved. This was deliberate, slow. I reached for the old hunting rifle Leonard had left behind, propped against the wall. I wasn't even sure if it worked, but having it in my hands made me feel better. I stayed still, waiting. Then another sound, this time closer, right outside the front porch. I tightened my grip on the rifle, my breath shallow. The door had a simple latch, nothing that would hold against real force. I kept waiting, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, without warning, the doorknob moved. Not violently, just a slow, testing turn. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The knob twisted again, this time a little harder. Then it stopped. Silence. Whoever was out there was thinking. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. The lamp on the table cast shadows against the walls, making everything feel smaller, tighter. I debated blowing it out, but that would mean sitting in total darkness. The porch creaked. Then came a long, dragging sound. like someone was pulling something heavy across the wooden boards. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but something in me knew better. Speaking would only confirm I was inside, alone. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I sat there for what felt like an hour, rifle in my hands, barely breathing. I kept waiting for another sound, another sign that whoever was out there hadn't left. But there was nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and move to the window. Slowly, carefully, I pulled the curtain back just an inch. The porch was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the rifle close, my eyes on the door. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the cabin settling, the crackling of the fire, even my own breath. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside. The air was cold, damp. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, undisturbed. But on the porch, right outside the door, were footprints. They weren't boot prints, not sneakers, bare feet, and they led back into the trees, disappearing into the forest. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin behind me, and left. The drive back felt longer than before, every shadow along the road making my skin crawl. I never went back. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted. But I do know one thing: Leonard left that cabin behind for a reason. And I wasn't gonna stick around long enough to find out why. It was the summer of 2004 when my dad's friend, Mark, invited me to his cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I had just turned 22, fresh out of college, and had nothing better to do. Mark was a good guy, one of those friends my dad had known since high school, the kind of friend who was more like an uncle. He owned a hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere, a place where he'd go to unwind, fish, and escape the busyness of life. I had been up there once or twice with my dad when I was a kid, but this was the first time I was going alone. The drive out took longer than I remembered. Mark had given me detailed directions, but the roads were all dirt, and some of the turns were barely marked. I had to backtrack a couple of times before I finally found the right path. The last few miles were rough, the kind of road that made you feel every rock and dip in your suspension. The trees grew thick, crowding the road on both sides, and by the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon. Mark's cabin wasn't much to look at. It was a small, one-story structure with a green metal roof and weathered wooden siding. A wraparound porch extended along the front, with a single rocking chair that looked like it had been sitting there for decades. There was a shed off to the side, a rusted propane tank, and an old fire pit surrounded by a few logs. Beyond that, it was just trees, miles and miles of them, stretching in every direction. Mark had told me he wouldn't be there when I arrived. He had some work to finish up in town and would be coming up the next morning. He left a spare key hidden under a loose plank on the porch and told me to make myself at home. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and damp fabric. It was small but comfortable, with a single main room that had a kitchenette, a couch, and a wood-burning stove. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. There was no TV, no cell service, and barely any electricity, just a couple of dim battery-powered lanterns. Mark had left a note on the kitchen counter telling me there was food in the cooler and extra firewood outside if I needed it. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking my bag and getting a fire going in the stove. The woods outside were already dark, and the silence was heavy. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of an owl. I had forgotten how quiet it could be out here. After heating up a can of chili and eating by the dim lantern light, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The porch creaked under my weight as I leaned against the railing, staring out at the tree line. The moon was barely a sliver, and the stars were swallowed by the thick canopy overhead. It was the kind of darkness that made you feel exposed, like something could be standing just a few feet away and you wouldn't even know it. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. It wasn't loud, but it was close, maybe 20 yards out, just beyond where my eyes could see. I held my breath, listening. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, but then I heard another noise, a slow, deliberate movement through the underbrush. Not the quick, startled steps of an animal, but something heavier, something careful. I grabbed the flashlight Mark had left on the counter and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the edge of the woods. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to the isolation, that the silence was playing tricks on me. I shut off the flashlight, went back inside, and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise outside made me jolt awake, my heart pounding in my chest. Around 2 a.m., I swore I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate steps, the wood creaking under the weight of something heavy. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, barely breathing. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up to find the front door unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. But now it was open just a crack, the morning breeze pushing it against the frame. I checked the cabin. Nothing was missing. Nothing looked disturbed. But that didn't make me feel any better. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. The dirt in front of the porch was soft from recent rain, and there were footprints, deep, heavy ones leading up to the door. They weren't mine. They were bigger. I didn't wait for Mark to arrive. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and got the hell out of there. I didn't care if it made me look paranoid. Mark called me later that day, asking why I had left early. I told him everything, the noises, the door, the footprints. He was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. "You did the right thing," he said. "You should have never been out there alone." I never went back to that cabin. Mark still owns it, but he doesn't go out there as often as he used to. Every now and then, he'll mention something strange. Things moved inside the cabin, footprints appearing where no one should have been. He doesn't talk about it much, and I don't ask. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I was not alone. I was 21 when I went on that trip. It was supposed to be just another college getaway. Something fun, something to break up the stress of midterms. A few of us had been talking about it for weeks. We wanted to go somewhere far from campus, somewhere quiet, where we could just drink, unwind, and not worry about classes or work. One of my friends found a cabin up in the mountains, a place that wasn't too expensive, and we all chipped in for a long weekend. There were 6 of us. We packed up on a Friday afternoon, stuffing our bags into the back of 2 cars, loading up on cheap food and beer, and heading out just before sunset. The drive wasn't supposed to take more than a couple of hours, but once we left the highway, the roads got worse. Potholes, sharp turns, stretches of nothing but trees on either side. The GPS kept losing signal, and after a while, we were just following printed directions and hoping we were still on the right path. It was dark by the time we got there. The cabin sat at the end of a long, narrow dirt road, surrounded by thick woods. There were no streetlights, no other houses nearby, just trees and shadows stretching out in every direction. The place itself was old but sturdy. Wooden walls, a wraparound porch, a stone chimney jutting up into the sky. Out back, there was a small fire pit and an old shed, the door hanging slightly open. We unloaded the cars, set up inside, and started drinking. The first night was loud. Music, laughter, the usual. No one was worried about the remoteness of the place. If anything, that was the appeal. No neighbors, no noise complaints, just us and the woods. But something felt off. Even that first night, I noticed it. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like the air around the cabin was too still. The woods were silent. No wind, no distant sounds of animals. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. A branch snapping, leaves rustling. But whenever I looked outside, I saw nothing. I didn't think much of it then. It wasn't until the next day that things got worse. We spent most of Saturday hiking. There was a trail behind the cabin that led up into the hills, and we followed it for hours. The trees were thick, towering overhead, blocking out most of the sky. It felt like we were walking deeper into nowhere, the world shrinking down to just the narrow path and the dense forest pressing in around us. At some point, we found an old clearing. There were signs that someone had camped there once. A fire pit, some scattered trash, the remains of a tent half buried under leaves. It looked abandoned, like no one had been there for years. We didn't stay long. Something about that place felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. The others joked about it, kicking at the trash, making up stories about whoever had camped there before. I didn't laugh. I just wanted to leave. On the way back, I kept hearing things. Not close, not loud, but there. The sound of footsteps in the brush, just off the trail. The others didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. I tried to tell myself it was just the woods, just animals moving through the trees. But that night, back at the cabin, I heard it again. We had the fire going out back, drinking, laughing, same as the night before. But the woods felt different. There was a weight in the air, something pressing down, making it harder to relax. At some point, I got up to grab another beer from inside. When I came back out, I saw something in the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the firelight, a shape standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the dark. But as I stared, my eyes adjusted, and I realized it wasn't just a shadow. Someone was standing there. I froze. The others were still talking, still drinking, not paying attention. I didn't move. I just watched. Whoever it was didn't move either. They just stood there, barely visible, just outside the reach of the fire's glow. I don't know how long I stared. It felt like forever. Then, in the time it took for me to blink, they were gone. I didn't say anything. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I had imagined it. Maybe I didn't want to sound paranoid. I just sat back down and tried to act normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me. At some point, I heard movement outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I lay still, barely breathing, listening. Then, a sound at the window. Not knocking, not scratching, just breathing. I wanted to look. I wanted to turn my head to see if something was really there. But I couldn't. I just stayed frozen, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Eventually, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I was convinced I had imagined it. Lack of sleep, too much to drink. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me. Until I stepped outside. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints. Not ours. These were different, barefoot. Dozens of them circling the cabin, leading out into the woods. I woke the others. No one had an explanation. No one wanted to stay another night. We packed up fast, throwing our stuff into the cars, not talking much. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. There, at the tree line, was a figure, standing still, watching. We didn't stop. We didn't go back. And we never talked about it again. I hadn't stepped foot in the old cabin for years. It had been my family's for decades. a small, sturdy place tucked deep into the woods. My grandfather built it with his own hands, and it had stood through storms, harsh winters, and long summers. I used to spend weekends there, chopping wood, fishing in the nearby creek, and staring up at the night sky through the clearing in the trees. But life moved on, and I stopped visiting. The last time I had been there was almost 10 years ago. I had been young, barely in my 20s, full of life and without any real responsibilities. Now, in my 30s, the cabin felt like a relic of another time, something left behind but not forgotten. It was late October when I finally returned. The days were getting shorter. The air carried that crisp bite of winter approaching. Leaves had already turned, covering the ground in layers of orange and brown. The drive took longer than I remembered, mostly because the old dirt roads were worse than before. I had to take it slow, steering around deep ruts and fallen branches. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking. The place looked the same, though the wood had darkened with age. The porch sagged a little more and the windows were dirtier, but it was still standing, still solid. I killed the engine, stepped out, and let the silence settle around me. The woods had a way of swallowing sound. No traffic, no voices, just the distant rustling of wind through the trees. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell inside was a mix of dust, wood, and something faintly musty. I flipped the light switch, and to my surprise, the electricity still worked. I had expected to rely on flashlights and lanterns, but the old wiring had held up. The place was simple: a small living area with a wood stove, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. There were still some of my grandfather's things lying around: an old hunting knife on the shelf, a stack of yellowed newspapers near the fireplace. I set my bag down and got to work. I checked the cabinets, finding a few canned goods that were probably too old to eat. The water didn't work. The well pump must have failed over the years. No big deal. I had brought enough supplies for the weekend. I started a fire in the wood stove to take the chill out of the air. The dry logs caught quickly, the flames casting flickering light across the room. I pulled a chair closer and sat down, letting the warmth sink in. That was when I first noticed it. Something felt off. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. The cabin was exactly how I had left it all those years ago. Nothing had been moved. Nothing was broken. But there was this strange feeling in my gut, something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I brushed it off as paranoia. It had been years since I'd been here. It was natural to feel a little uneasy. The silence, the isolation, the weight of old memories. I told myself that was all it was, but that feeling didn't go away. As the night deepened, the woods outside grew darker than I remembered. There was no moon, just an empty black sky stretching over the treetops. The fire crackled softly, the only real sound in the cabin. Then I heard it, a noise outside, a dull thud, not a branch falling, not an animal. It was something deliberate, something solid. I sat up, heart suddenly hammering in my chest. I strained to listen, but there was only silence. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But then it came again. Thud. Closer this time. I stood, moving slowly toward the window. The glass was dirty, smeared with years of dust and grime, but I could still make out the trees. Nothing moved. I grabbed the old hunting knife from the shelf, just in case. Another sound, this one from the side of the cabin. A scraping noise. I felt my breath catch. I wasn't alone. I moved toward the door as quietly as I could. My boots barely made a sound against the wooden floor. I reached for the handle, hesitated, then slowly unlocked it. I stepped outside, knife in hand. The air was colder than before. The fire inside had made the cabin warm, but out here, the chill bit deep. My breath fogged in front of me. The trees stood still, no wind, no movement. I scanned the area. Nothing. Just as I started to relax, I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh ones, leading around the side of the cabin. I turned sharply, my grip tightening on the knife. My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a slow step forward, following the tracks. They led toward the back of the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I stopped, listening again. Silence. Then a rustle. Close. Too close. I turned just in time to see a shadow moving between the trees. A figure. Someone was out here, watching me. I backed toward the cabin, my chest tight with panic. I reached the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. Nothing, but I knew what I saw. Someone was out there. The next few hours were the longest of my life. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, every muscle in my body tense. I kept waiting for another sound, another sign. Then, just past midnight, it happened. The door handle moved. Not the wind, not an accident. Someone was trying to get in. I leapt to my feet, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then bang. The whole door shook. I backed away, my mind racing. There was no one I could call. No neighbors, no nearby houses. Bang. Another hit, harder this time. I ran to the back of the cabin. The window was my only escape. I shoved it open and climbed through, landing hard on the ground. I turned and sprinted for the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Only then did I finally turn around. The cabin was just a dark shape in the distance, and in front of it, standing in the firelight, was a man, tall, motionless, watching me. I never went back. I reported it to the police, but nothing ever came of it. They found the cabin untouched. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. Nothing. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there, and I know they were waiting for me. I sold the cabin soon after. Let someone else have it. I never wanted to see it again. I was never one to scare easily. I had grown up hunting, fishing, and spending nights alone in the woods since I was a teenager. By the time I was in my late 30s, I had seen my fair share of strange things in the wilderness. Odd noises, shadows moving in places they shouldn't, even the occasional drifter who looked like he had no business being that far out. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compared to what happened when I spent a week at my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Montana back in 2015. My uncle Ray had owned that cabin for decades. He used to take me and my cousins out there when we were kids, teaching us how to track deer, skin a rabbit, or set up camp if we ever found ourselves stranded. The place was a simple structure. One big room with a wood stove in the center, a small kitchen area, and a cot against the back wall. There was an outhouse about 30 yards away, and a tiny shed where he kept tools and extra supplies. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional. Ray had passed away a few months before, and his cabin was left abandoned. I hadn't been up there in years, but something about it called to me. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was the need for some time away from everything. Either way, I packed up my truck with enough food, water, and gear to last a week, and I made the drive out there alone. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The dirt road leading up to it was rough, barely more than a trail. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. The place looked just as I remembered it. Weathered logs, a slanted metal roof, and that old familiar smell of damp wood and pine needles. I got the door open with the spare key I had and stepped inside. Dust had settled over everything. Cobwebs stretched from the rafters. A few old hunting magazines were stacked on the table, exactly where Ray had probably left them. It was strange being there alone, but I didn't mind. I spent the first night getting settled, clearing out some of the dust, and starting a fire in the wood stove. I cooked a quick meal, had a couple of beers, and stretched out on the cot, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I had spent most of the day hiking around the property, checking the old deer blinds, and making sure everything was still in good shape. When I got back, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single footprint in the dirt near the shed. It wasn't mine. I had been all over the area that day, and I knew for a fact I hadn't stepped in that spot. The print was deep, meaning whoever left it had been standing there for a while. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an old print that had just been uncovered by the wind. Maybe I had missed it earlier. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I locked the cabin door, a habit I normally didn't bother with out there. I sat by the fire, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. The woods were silent, too silent. No owls, no distant rustling of deer moving through the brush, just the wind. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me sit up, listening. I kept my rifle close, though I told myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. The footprint was gone, not covered up, not washed away by rain, just gone, as if the dirt had been smoothed over perfectly. I stared at the spot for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was losing it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep myself busy, chopping wood, checking the fishing traps down by the creek. But that creeping feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I turned my back, I felt it. Every time I walked away from the cabin, I glanced over my shoulder. That night, things escalated. I woke up around 2 in the morning, heart pounding, but I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light over the room. Then I heard it, a soft creak, not from inside the cabin, from outside. I sat up slowly, every hair on my body standing on end. I reached for my rifle, keeping my breath steady. The sound came again, closer this time, near the porch. Then nothing. Minutes passed. I listened so hard my ears started ringing. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I turned my head toward the small window near the door, and I saw him, a figure just beyond the glass, tall, motionless. His face was impossible to make out in the dark, but he was there, staring. I gripped my rifle tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't move for the rest of the night. By morning, he was gone. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I didn't waste time packing up. I threw my gear into the truck and got the hell out of there. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing. He had been watching me long before I ever noticed him, and that, more than anything, is what still keeps me awake at night. It was the kind of cold that settled in your bones, the kind that made every joint ache even before the wind hit your face. The cabin was old, small, and the kind of place that had been built for hard winters and harder men. I had been working as a forest ranger for a few years, covering a stretch of remote woodland in Montana, and I had stayed in a lot of different cabins before. Some were well-maintained, stocked with supplies, and even had working radios. Others, like this one, were barely standing, left to rot in a part of the woods most people didn't want to go. The station sent me out to check on a hunting permit issue, poachers most likely, who had been seen too close to restricted land. It was supposed to be a routine overnight shift, just a last check-in before I moved on to the next sector. I had parked my truck about a mile away, where the dirt trail ended, and hiked in through thick trees with my pack slung over my shoulder, carrying enough food for a night, my rifle, and my radio. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had already started to drop behind the treeline. The place was barely holding itself together. The wooden walls were warped from the seasons, and the roof sagged under the weight of too many heavy winters. There was no electricity, no working plumbing, and no guarantee the old wood stove inside would even work. The last ranger who stayed here had left months ago, and I doubted anyone had come through since. I forced the swollen door open and stepped inside. It smelled of damp wood, dust, and something else. Something stale like old sweat or rotting fabric. The inside was just as rough as the outside. A cot sat in the corner with a thin, stained mattress. A rusted stove took up most of the back wall. A small wooden table sat in the middle of the room, its surface covered in scratches. I set my pack down, checked the stove, and found just enough firewood stacked inside to last the night. I didn't plan to sleep much anyway, just make it through the night, log whatever I saw, and get out in the morning. The sun dipped lower. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line, taking in the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. Not a single bird, no movement in the underbrush. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of old wood as the cabin settled behind me. Something about that silence put me on edge. In the deep woods, even in winter, there was always something moving. Rabbits, deer, even the distant call of a coyote. But here, nothing. I shook the feeling off and started a fire inside. The warmth helped, but it didn't take the edge off. The wind picked up outside, rattling the walls and whistling through the gaps between the logs. I sat at the table, my rifle propped up against the leg, and took a sip of coffee from my thermos. Then I heard it, a noise outside, a crunch, like a footstep. I froze, listened, nothing. I stood up slowly, moving toward the window. The glass was old and fogged, covered in dust, but I could just make out the dark shapes of trees outside. My truck was too far away to see, but the trail I had hiked in on was visible. I watched, waited, still nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch breaking under the weight of ice. I had spent enough time in the woods to know that your mind could play tricks on you when you were alone. Still, I reached for my rifle, resting it against my leg as I sat back down. Another crunch, closer this time. My heart pounded. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree. Something was moving outside. I stood up and slowly unlatched the door. I opened it just enough to look out. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting. The trees stood still, the snow on the ground untouched. But I knew something had moved. I knew it. I waited. Nothing. I closed the door, locking it this time, and sat back down. The fire crackled behind me, casting long shadows across the walls. I kept my rifle in my hands now, my pulse still racing. Then I heard something else. Breathing. It was faint, just beyond the walls of the cabin. Slow, steady, not an animal. Too controlled, too deliberate. I swallowed hard, gripping my rifle tighter. I had been in the woods long enough to know what animals sound like. This wasn't an animal. I moved to the window again, peering out into the night. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed slightly, casting strange shapes across the snow. But then I saw it, a figure, standing just at the edge of the treeline. Still, watching. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a hunter. It was a person standing too still, too quiet. I couldn't see any details, just the outline against the trees, just the shape of something human but wrong. I stepped back from the window. The breathing outside had stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then, a sound against the door. A scratch. Slow. Purposeful. I raised my rifle, aiming at the door, my hand steady despite the hammering in my chest. The scratching stopped. Silence again. The wind howled outside. The fire crackled. My own breath felt too loud in the small space. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to break in. They were waiting. I stayed awake all night, never lowering my rifle. The footsteps would start and stop, sometimes near the window, sometimes by the door. At one point, I heard something scrape against the wall. Fingernails, a knife, something dragging. Then, just before dawn, the sound stopped. I waited, listened. Nothing. The first light of morning crept through the trees. I forced myself to move, to get up, to check outside. I unlatched the door, rifle ready, and stepped out onto the frozen ground. Tracks. They circled the cabin, moving back and forth. Some were deep, like whoever had been out there had been standing in place for a long time. Then I saw something else. A message carved into the wood of the cabin wall. Not yet. I didn't waste time. I packed my things, grabbed my rifle, and hiked back to my truck. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was shaking. I told my supervisor I wasn't going back to that sector. They didn't ask why. A week later, the cabin burned down. No one knows how. I never went back. I never found out who or what was out there that night. But I know one thing. They'll be back. I spent the last winter in my uncle's old hunting cabin, deep in the woods of Montana. I had just turned 35, and life in the city had gotten too loud, too fast. My uncle, who had long since moved to Florida, offered the place to me for a season. It was old, isolated, but sturdy. The thought of being alone in the snow-covered wilderness seemed like the perfect way to reset my mind. The cabin sat about 20 miles from the nearest town, a 2-hour drive from the closest grocery store, and at least 5 miles from the next occupied property. It had everything I needed: wood-burning stove, a small generator, enough canned food and dry goods to last me the winter. I had a rifle for hunting, a radio for emergencies, and plenty of firewood stacked outside. The first weeks were peaceful. I spent my days chopping wood, setting traps for small game, and reading old books my uncle had left behind. Snow fell thick and steady, covering the world in silence. Felt like stepping into a forgotten place, untouched by time. Then, sometime in mid-January, strange things started happening. I woke one morning to find footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. They started at the tree line and ended just a few yards from my front door. No tracks leading away. The snow had stopped falling in the night, and these prints were fresh. I stepped outside, wrapped in my thick coat, and crouched down to inspect them. The prints were deep, heavier than mine, wider too. They weren't from an animal. Too large, too clean. Someone had been standing there, watching my cabin in the dark. I checked the area, circling around the trees, my rifle slung over my shoulder. No sign of anyone. The air was crisp, the forest still. Whoever had been there was gone. That night, I locked the door and set my rifle by my bed. Days passed without incident. I convinced myself the tracks were nothing. Maybe a hunter passing through, someone lost, someone curious. But then the whistling started. It came late at night, a high, slow tune carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the trees shifting, the wind squeezing through the branches. But it was too distinct. It followed a pattern. 3 notes, pause. 3 notes, pause. The first time I heard it, I sat up in bed, staring at the dark window. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of my own mind. The second time, I grabbed my rifle and sat in the chair by the window, waiting. Nothing ever came. A few days later, I went hunting deeper into the woods, hoping to clear my head. I knew the land well enough, followed my uncle's old maps. There was supposed to be nothing out there, just trees, hills, a frozen creek. But I found something that shouldn't have been there. A cabin. It was old, much older than mine, its roof half collapsed, its windows broken. It looked abandoned, like it had been left to rot decades ago. But there were footprints in the snow leading inside. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. It made no sense. There was no record of any other cabins nearby. My uncle never mentioned it. And yet, there it was. I walked closer, rifle ready. The door was slightly open, just enough for me to see inside. Something felt wrong. It smelled wrong, like damp wood and something else, something rotten. I turned back and left. That night, the whistling was closer. It was late February when things got worse. I woke to the sound of something scratching against the cabin door. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragging against the wood. I didn't move. I listened. The scratching stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, heavy, circling the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my rifle, my fingers gripping the cold metal. Then silence. I waited until the first light of morning before opening the door. There, in the snow, were more footprints. They circled the cabin twice before stopping at the window where I slept. I didn't sleep that next night. March arrived, bringing colder nights and heavier snow. I had planned to stay until April, but now I was counting the days until I could leave. One evening, as the sun was setting, I saw something in the trees, a shape tall and still standing between the branches. It wasn't moving, just watching. I raised my rifle, took a step forward. The figure stepped back, fading into the shadows of the forest. I didn't follow. That night, I barricaded the door with furniture, kept the fire burning until morning. My last night in the cabin, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. The fear had settled into my bones, deeper than the cold. I had packed my truck, ready to leave at first light. But something didn't want me to go. The whistling started just after midnight, closer than ever. The scratching returned, but not just at the door, at the windows, at the walls. It was surrounding me. I grabbed my rifle and backed into the corner of the room, my breath sharp, my hands tight around the stock. The sounds continued for hours, slow, deliberate, waiting. Then, just before dawn, silence. I didn't wait. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I grabbed my keys, my bags, and rushed to the truck. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine sputtered, struggling in the cold. I looked up just once toward the tree line. There, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure, tall, still, watching. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into drive and didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't tell my uncle everything, just that I had changed my mind about staying long-term. A few months later, I looked up old land records. The abandoned cabin wasn't on any map. No records, no history. Shouldn't have been there. I don't know what was in those woods. Person? Something else? I only know one thing. Something was watching me that winter, and it didn't want me to leave. I'm glad I did. I had planned for a simple hike, nothing too far, nothing too deep into the woods. Just a few hours of walking, fresh air, and maybe some time to clear my head. It was the kind of thing I did every so often when life got too heavy, when work pushed me too hard, or when I just needed to be alone. I checked the forecast before I left. It said there might be light rain later in the evening, but that was nothing to worry about. I had my waterproof jacket, my flashlight, and my small pack with the essentials: water, a knife, some protein bars, and a lighter. Just enough in case I needed it. The trail I picked wasn't a popular one. I liked it that way. It wasn't an official hiking route, just a path that some locals used every now and then. I had walked parts of it before, but never the full loop. It was supposed to circle back to where I parked my truck. A 6-hour round trip, give or take. I started late in the afternoon, maybe around 3. The air was damp, the sky overcast, but it felt good to be out. The first couple of hours went fine. The trees were tall, thick, and packed close together, making everything feel quieter than it actually was. My boots crunched against wet leaves. Birds rustled through the branches, but otherwise, it was peaceful. At some point, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. The path had split in two, and without thinking, I went left. It wasn't an obvious mistake at first. The ground still looked like a trail, narrow, uneven, but still a trail. I kept walking, figuring it would loop back or at least connect to the main path again. But after another hour, the trail was gone. It wasn't a sudden thing. It just sort of faded. The dirt path became scattered leaves. The packed down ground became uneven, with tree roots jutting out at odd angles. I looked around and realized I had no clue where I was. I checked my phone, no service. I wasn't panicking yet. I had my flashlight and I had my bearings, or at least I thought I did. The sun was setting, but I figured if I kept moving in a straight line, I'd find my way back to something familiar. Then the rain started. At first, it was light, just a mist in the air, but soon it became steady. Cold, heavy drops pelted my jacket. The temperature dropped fast, and the wet soaked through my sleeves. The trees dripped, their leaves shaking under the weight of the rain. My boots slipped in the mud. I picked up my pace, moving faster now. I wasn't just lost. I was getting cold, and the last thing I needed was to spend the night out here. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Just a shape in the distance, hidden between trees. A shadow that looked too square to be natural. I moved closer, my breath heavy, my hands clenched into fists. It was a cabin, old, small, and barely standing. The roof sagged. The wood was gray and split in places, and the windows were dark. No lights, no smoke from a chimney, no sign that anyone had been there for years. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong. But the rain was getting worse, and I needed shelter. I told myself I'd only stay until the storm passed, just long enough to warm up, to get my bearings. The door was unlocked, creaked when I pushed it open. The inside smelled damp, like rotting wood and old earth. My flashlight flickered across the room. Dust, broken furniture, a fireplace filled with ashes long since gone cold. There was a small table, a chair with one leg missing, and a cot pushed against the wall. The mattress was stained, torn open in places, and the blankets were balled up like someone had left in a hurry. I shut the door behind me. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, making the whole cabin shudder. I moved toward the fireplace, kneeling down to check if anything was left to burn. Nothing, just wet, blackened wood. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. Boot prints, not mine. They were dried into the dirt-covered floor, leading from the door to the cot. Someone had been here, recently. I stood up fast, scanning the room again. It looked abandoned, but those prints hadn't been there long. The rain slammed against the roof. The wind made the door rattle in its frame. Then, outside, I heard something move. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, careful, close. My flashlight beam jumped across the room as I turned toward the door. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath. Another step, then another. Whoever it was, they were right outside. I backed up, pressing myself into the corner of the room, keeping my flashlight pointed at the door. The handle rattled. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The door didn't open. Whoever was out there, they were waiting. The wind screamed through the trees. The rain slammed against the roof. My fingers tightened around the handle of my flashlight. Then silence. No more footsteps. No more rattling. Just the sound of the storm. I waited. Minutes passed, but I didn't move. My whole body was locked in place, every muscle tensed, waiting for whatever came next. But nothing happened. Slowly, I crept toward the window. I wiped away the grime with my sleeve and peeked outside. The rain blurred everything, turning the trees into dark, shifting shapes. I couldn't see anyone. I swallowed hard. Whoever had been out there was gone, or hiding. I didn't stay to find out. I grabbed my pack, turned off my flashlight to avoid giving away my position, and eased the door open just an inch. The wind slammed into me, but I ignored it. I listened. Nothing. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the mud. The rain hit my face like ice. I didn't look back. I just ran. Branches scraped my arms. My feet slid on wet leaves. I didn't stop, not until I saw something familiar. The trail. The real one. The one I had lost hours ago. I followed it, moving as fast as I could. My chest burned. My legs ached. But I kept going. When I finally saw my truck, parked exactly where I had left it, I almost collapsed. I didn't even pause to catch my breath. I just yanked the door open, jumped inside, and locked it. I sat there for a long time, listening to the rain hammer against the windshield, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't know who had been out there. I didn't want to know. I just knew that if I had stayed in that cabin any longer, I wouldn't have made it out, and I wasn't going back to find out why. It was a bad idea from the start. I knew it the moment I agreed, but the money was good and I needed it. The job was simple enough, at least on paper. I was supposed to watch over an old cabin on the edge of a graveyard for a few nights. The property belonged to an old man named Victor Holman, a retired gravedigger who'd passed away a few months ago. The land was tied up in legal issues, and until things were sorted, the Holman family needed someone to keep an eye on the place to prevent vandalism or squatters. The cabin wasn't much. One room, a small kitchen, an old wood stove, and a single bed shoved against the far wall. No bathroom, just an outhouse a few yards away. It sat right at the tree line where the woods met the cemetery. Holman had lived there for decades, taking care of the graveyard until he was too old to do the work himself. From what I heard, he barely spoke to anyone, kept to himself, and never let anyone near his place. The first night, it rained hard. I drove up the narrow dirt path leading to the cabin, my truck's headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. The graveyard came into view first, a stretch of old headstones and crooked crosses, some leaning at odd angles, barely visible in the downpour. The Holman cabin sat just beyond, its dark shape barely standing out against the trees behind it. I parked, grabbed my bag, and ran for the door. The rain was cold, soaking through my jacket before I even reached the porch. I fumbled with the key, finally getting the door open, and stepped inside. The air was stale. Dust clung to every surface. A thick smell of old wood, damp earth, and something else, something faint, like rotting leaves, hung in the air. I dropped my bag by the door, took out my flashlight, and shined it around the room. The place was just as small as I'd been told. A wooden table in the center, a few rusted tools hanging from the walls, and the old bed covered in a thin, stained blanket. I locked the door behind me and set up my things. I'd brought a camping stove, some canned food, and a thermos of coffee. The cabin had no electricity, and my phone barely had service, but I had a flashlight, extra batteries, and a lantern. It would be enough. The rain drummed against the roof, a steady rhythm that made the place feel even more isolated. I sat at the table, eating a can of beans straight from the tin, when I heard something outside, a rustling just beyond the window. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The wind? An animal? I stood up slowly, moving toward the window. The glass was streaked with rain, but I could see the graveyard through the trees. I scanned the rows of headstones, looking for movement. Nothing. I waited a little longer, then shook it off. Probably just the wind pushing the branches against the cabin. I went to bed early, lying under the thin blanket with my jacket still on. The bed creaked beneath my weight. Outside, the rain kept falling. I closed my eyes and listened to it, trying to ignore the way the wind seemed to carry faint sounds. Whispers, almost. Just the trees, I told myself. Just the wind through the graves. Eventually, I slept. I woke up to silence. The rain had stopped. No wind, just dead, heavy silence. I turned onto my side, staring at the dark room. My breath felt too loud in my own ears. Something felt wrong. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the wooden table, the walls, the door. Everything was the same as before. Then I noticed the footprints.
Vet, muddy footprints.
Leading from the door. They weren't mine. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The prints were clear, fresh. A single set coming in from the door, but not going back out. I gripped the flashlight tighter, scanning the cabin. There was nowhere to hide. The place was too small. I was alone. I stood up, moving toward the door. The lock was still in place. No sign of forced entry. I checked my boots. They were still by the door, dry. These weren't mine. I followed the footprints with my light. They stopped near the foot of my bed. Someone had been inside. I checked every inch of the cabin. Under the bed, behind the wood stove, even outside on the porch. Nothing. No one. The graveyard was silent. The trees unmoving. I went back inside and shut the door, double-checking the lock. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came slow. Gray light filtered through the window. I spent most of the day outside, checking the area. The rain had washed away any tracks beyond the porch, but I found something else. Something worse. Near the edge of the graveyard, right where the trees began, I saw a hole.
Agrave.
But it wasn't fresh. It had been dug up. The earth was piled to the sides, the casket inside cracked open. I didn't look inside. I didn't want to know. I went back to the cabin and packed my things. I didn't care about the money anymore. Before I left, I checked the door one last time. That's when I saw the marks. Scratches, deep, uneven, along the wood. Not from an animal. Too deliberate, too human. I left. I never found out who had been in the cabin with me that night, or who or what had climbed out of that grave. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that some things should be left buried. I had been working long hours for months, and I needed a break from everything, the noise, the people, the constant pressure. I wanted silence. I wanted to be somewhere far away, where no one could call me or knock on my door. My friend Luke owned a cabin in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods of Montana. He used it for hunting trips, but he told me I could borrow it for as long as I wanted. It was mid-October when I drove out there. The trip took nearly 6 hours, the last 2 on rough dirt roads that barely looked used. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the air was cold. The sky was that deep, clear blue you only see in autumn, with the sun already dipping low. The cabin was simple, a small, one-room structure made of rough logs with a tin roof. There was a wood stove, a bed, a table, and a few shelves stocked with old canned food and hunting gear. No electricity, no running water, just a well out back and a bucket to draw from it. That was fine by me. I came here to be alone. I unpacked my truck, stacked some firewood inside, and lit the stove. The warmth spread slowly, the fire crackling as I settled in. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, their bare branches scratching against each other. It felt peaceful, exactly what I needed. That night, I fell asleep fast, exhausted from the long drive. The only sounds were the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old wood shifting as the temperature dropped. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me out of sleep. I held still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim red glow in the cabin. I could hear the wind outside, but nothing else. Then I heard it, a sound just outside the cabin. It was soft, like footsteps in the leaves. I held my breath, my heart pounding. Could have been an animal. This deep in the woods, that was the most logical thing to assume. But something about the sound felt deliberate, like someone trying to be quiet. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining it at the window. The glass was fogged from my breath, but I could make out the trees, their branches shifting in the wind. I didn't see anything. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, and they were undisturbed except for a few places where small animals had passed through. No clear footprints. I told myself I must have imagined it. I spent the day hiking around the woods, getting familiar with the area. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees packed tight together. The only trails were old logging roads, mostly overgrown. There was a stream nearby, its water cold and clear. As the sun set, I made my way back to the cabin, feeling better. The fresh air had done me good, and I was starting to relax. I cooked a simple dinner on the stove, then sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The forest was quiet, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. That night, I woke up again. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing, slow, close, right outside the cabin wall. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The fire had died down again, the room mostly dark. I reached for the flashlight with shaking hands and turned it on, shining it toward the door. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, barely moving. The breathing had stopped. The wind outside had died down, and the world was completely silent. I told myself it was my imagination. I had been alone for too long, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin again, looking for tracks. This time, I saw something. Near the side of the cabin, the leaves were disturbed, as if someone had been standing there. I crouched down, my stomach tightening. There were no clear footprints, just scuffed leaves, but it was enough. Something had been there. I told myself it was a deer, a bear maybe, but deep down I knew better. That night, I locked the door and made sure my hunting knife was within reach. I sat up in bed for hours, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps outside, then a long, slow creak as the porch boards shifted under weight. Someone was standing outside my door. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife and stood up slowly. The fire had burned down to coals, casting long shadows across the cabin. I took a deep breath, then turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window. For a split second, I saw something move, a shape just beyond the glass. It was gone before I could focus on it, vanishing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things, threw them in the truck, and got ready to go. But before I left, I walked around the cabin one last time. On the porch, right by the door, was a single footprint. It was a boot print, a man's boot. I drove out of there as fast as I could, barely stopping until I hit the main road. I never went back. Luke sold the cabin the next year. He had never experienced anything strange there, but he told me the new owner only stayed a few nights before putting it up for sale again. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods, and I don't want to know. hadn't seen my cousin Mark in years. Life got in the way, as it does, and though we grew up close, we drifted apart. He became a cop, stationed in a small town a few hours from where I lived. I worked construction, took jobs where I could, and never really settled down. But when he invited me up to his cabin for a weekend of hunting, I figured it would be a good chance to reconnect. The cabin was deep in the woods, about an hour outside the town he worked in. He said he used it to get away from everything: work, people, the stress of the job. It was a small, old wooden place, originally built by our grandfather, and Mark had fixed it up over the years. The area around it was quiet, nothing but trees, hills, and an old dirt road leading up to it. I arrived in the afternoon, driving up that long dirt road, my truck kicking up dust as I got closer. The place looked exactly like I remembered from when we were kids, though Mark had replaced some of the rotting wood and reinforced the porch. There was a shed out back, filled with tools and hunting gear, and an old fire pit a few yards away. Mark was waiting for me on the porch, dressed in his usual casual clothes, a beer in hand. He looked older than I remembered, a little worn out, but still the same guy. We didn't talk much, just nodded, shook hands, and I unloaded my gear. That evening, we sat by the fire, drinking and catching up. He told me about his work, how things had gotten worse in town, crime picking up in ways he never expected. Drugs, violence, people disappearing. I figured it was just small-town paranoia, the way cops see the worst in everything. But there was something in his voice that made me uneasy. The first night was quiet. We slept in the cabin, both of us exhausted from the drive and the drinks. But I woke up at some point in the night, not sure why. It was dead silent outside. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I wasn't even sure what woke me, but something didn't feel right. I got up, checked the window, but saw nothing, just trees and darkness. I went back to bed, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, we got up early, had coffee, and headed out to hunt. The forest was dense, the kind of place where it was easy to get turned around if you weren't paying attention. We walked for a few hours, tracking deer, but the woods felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something wasn't right. Mark felt it too. He kept glancing around, his hand resting near the rifle slung over his shoulder. I finally asked him what was wrong, but he just shook his head and muttered something about the woods being different than he remembered. We found tracks, but they didn't seem right. They looked like deer, but off. The spacing was weird, like whatever made them was limping or dragging something. Mark crouched down, staring at them for a long time before saying we should head back. That night, we sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the woods. It was better than the silence from the night before, but there was still something unsettling about it. Mark was quieter than usual, drinking more, looking toward the trees every few minutes. Around midnight, we heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just beyond the tree line. Not an animal, something heavier. Mark stood up, grabbed his rifle, and stared into the dark. I followed his lead, my heart pounding. We waited, listening. Then the footsteps stopped. The woods went silent again. Mark muttered something under his breath and told me to get inside. Neither of us slept that night. We sat inside, rifles close, waiting for something, anything to happen. Morning came and Mark decided we should check the area. We walked the tree line, looking for tracks, signs of anything. And we found them. Footprints. Human ones. Barefoot. Deep in the mud. Circling the cabin. Mark swore under his breath. He looked around, scanning the woods like he expected someone to jump out. "We should go," I said, but he shook his head. Not yet. He wasn't scared. He was angry. We followed the tracks deeper into the woods, keeping our rifles ready. They led us to an old, abandoned hunting shack, barely standing, its wood rotting, the roof caving in. Mark pushed the door open, and the smell hit us first. Something rotten, something wrong. Inside, there were old blankets, empty food cans, and a pile of bones in the corner. Animal bones, mostly, but there were other things too. Clothing, a shoe. Mark clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around his rifle. We need to go back. We got out of there fast, heading straight for the cabin. Mark was tense, his whole body rigid. When we got back, he told me to pack up. We left within the hour, driving back to town in silence. Before we parted ways, Mark told me he'd be reporting it, but something in his voice told me he didn't think it would do much good. A few days later, I got a call. Mark told me they found someone in the woods, a man, living out there, surviving off stolen supplies, hunting whatever he could. They found more bones in that shack. Some weren't animal. They arrested him, but Mark didn't sound relieved. He sounded tired, like he knew it wasn't over. I never went back to that cabin. Mark sold it a month later. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching us, it wasn't just some random drifter. It had been there a long time, and Mark knew it wasn't the only one. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to sink behind the thick tree line. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a few days away from the city, just me and the stillness of the woods. I had rented the place online, an old, single-story log cabin deep in the forest of northern Montana. The listing had mentioned its remoteness, the nearest town being nearly an hour away. That had been part of the appeal. No noise, no distractions, just quiet. The drive up had been long, the roads winding and uneven, cutting through dense pine and birch. I had stopped for gas at the last town, stocked up on some food, filled a cooler with ice. I didn't plan on leaving the cabin much once I arrived. The place itself was simple, a small porch with a rocking chair, a stone chimney running up one side. The inside was rustic, the walls dark with age, the floors creaking under every step. There was a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom in the back, and a bathroom with a dim light bulb that flickered when I switched it on. I put my things away, made sure everything was in order. The air smelled of damp wood and old dust. There were no neighbors nearby, no cell service. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through them. By nightfall, the cabin was swallowed in darkness. I had brought a battery-powered lantern and a flashlight, but I kept the fireplace going for the warmth. The isolation started to settle in then, the reality of being completely alone. Every noise outside was suddenly amplified, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Normal forest sounds, I told myself. Animals moving through the brush. I went to bed early, listening to the wind push against the wooden walls. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up, staring into the darkness, feeling like something was off. Not wrong exactly, but different. A shift in the atmosphere, like the woods outside were watching. I finally dozed off sometime after midnight. When I woke again, it was because of a noise outside. A distinct, deliberate sound. Footsteps on gravel. I sat up, heart pounding. The cabin had a small dirt driveway, but I hadn't heard any vehicles approach. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, aimed it toward the window. The glass was too dirty to see much, just the vague outline of trees and the faint reflection of my own face. The footsteps had stopped. I stayed still, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. Nothing. After a long moment, I got up, slowly, moving toward the front door. I didn't open it, just stood there, listening. I could feel the weight of silence pressing against me. Then, another sound. This time, not footsteps, but something else. A slow, dragging noise, just beyond the porch. Something was out there. I backed away, turned off the flashlight. I I didn't want to be seen from the outside. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A deer? Maybe a bear? But bears didn't make dragging noises like that. I stood there for what felt like forever, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound, every creak of the wood, sent my nerves into overdrive. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. The ground was disturbed, but not in a way I could immediately understand. The dirt had been pushed aside in a strange, uneven pattern, like something had been dragged, but not in a straight line. I circled the cabin, looking for any signs of an animal or something else. I found nothing, just the disturbed dirt and the lingering sense of unease. The day passed slowly. I tried to shake off the night before, telling myself I had imagined most of it, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But as evening approached, that feeling of being watched returned. It was subtle at first, just an itch at the back of my mind, but as the light faded, it grew stronger. I kept the fire going, kept the lantern on. I stayed inside, listening. And then, sometime past midnight, the noise came again. The dragging, closer this time, right outside the window. I forced myself to look. My heart was hammering, but when I shined the flashlight out the glass, there was nothing. I was done. I packed my things quickly, stuffing my bag with whatever I could grab. I didn't care about the food, the supplies. I just wanted to be out of there. I threw everything into my truck, turned the key in the ignition, and drove. Fast. The road was pitch black, the headlights cutting through the trees. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the town. The next morning, I called the owner, told him there was something wrong with the place. I didn't explain, just said I was leaving early. He didn't ask any questions, just said, "All right," like he knew. I don't know what was out there. Maybe nothing, maybe something, but I do know one thing. I won't ever go back to that cabin, and I won't ever go that deep into the woods alone again. I had been driving through France for the better part of a week, taking back roads and stopping in small towns, enjoying the quiet of the countryside. I wasn't in a rush to be anywhere. I just wanted to be away from everything for a while. The kind of trip where you don't plan too much, just take the road as it comes. It had been years since I'd allowed myself a break like this, and I figured I owed it to myself. Most nights, I found cheap motels or small inns to stay in, but on the fourth night, I decided to push further into a rural area. The sun had started dipping below the horizon, and I was already far from any real town. I pulled out my phone to look for nearby lodging, but the signal was weak. After driving for another 20 minutes, I finally saw a sign pointing toward a small bed and breakfast style cabin up in the hills. It wasn't listed on my map, but at this point, I just wanted a place to sleep. I followed the winding dirt road leading to the cabin. The trees grew denser the further I drove, their branches reaching over the path like they wanted to swallow it whole. The sky was a deep blue by the time I saw the cabin. It was a modest structure, wooden, weathered, and set slightly back from the road. A warm light glowed through one of the windows, a sign that someone was inside. I parked my car off to the side and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. A sign near the front porch confirmed that this was indeed a bed and breakfast. I knocked on the door and waited. After a few moments, an older woman answered. She looked to be in her late 60s, with tired eyes and a reserved expression. She let me in without much fuss and showed me to a small room upstairs. It was simple, just a bed, a small desk, and a single window that overlooked the dark forest. She told me breakfast was at 7 in the morning and that I was the only guest for the night. I nodded, thanked her, and locked the door behind me. The cabin creaked with the wind outside, but it wasn't unsettling. If anything, it was peaceful. I set my bag down, washed up in the small attached bathroom, and climbed into bed. The mattress was firm, the sheets clean. Within minutes, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me up. I was suddenly wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was silent except for the occasional groan of the wooden walls. I turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around me. That's when I noticed something, movement outside my window. It was subtle, just a flicker of motion in the darkness. I sat up slowly, my heart starting to pound. The window faced the tree line, where the forest began only a few meters from the cabin. I squinted into the night, trying to see what had caught my attention. Then I saw him. A man stood just beyond the trees, half hidden by the shadows. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. His posture was unnatural, rigid, like he was holding himself too still. I could barely make out any features, but something about him set off every alarm in my mind. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. I didn't move either. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Another step. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling in the dark. No signal. The man took another step, moving into a patch of moonlight. I could see him more clearly now. His clothes were tattered, his face obscured by the angle of his head. But it was his posture that unsettled me the most. He was hunched slightly, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, as if he was a puppet with cut strings. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and moved toward the door. My instinct told me not to turn on the light, not to draw attention to myself. I checked the lock. It was secure. I stood there, listening, my ear pressed against the wood. Silence. I glanced back at the window. The man was gone. A new kind of fear settled into my bones. I stayed where I was, my mind racing. Maybe he had just been passing through, someone lost in the woods. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Then the floorboards creaked downstairs. I nearly stopped breathing. I strained to hear. Another creak. It wasn't the natural groan of an old building shifting. It was slow, deliberate. Someone was inside. I backed away from the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. My mind was already jumping ahead, trying to figure out what to do. The window. No, I was on the second floor, and even if I could make the jump, I'd land right where I had seen him standing. Another creak. I pressed myself against the far wall, my eyes darting around the room. There was nothing I could use as a weapon, nothing to barricade the door with. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside my room. I could hear breathing, not deep, normal breaths, shallow, uneven. I felt my stomach twist. The doorknob rattled. I sucked in a breath, my entire body going rigid. The lock held. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away. Slow, measured. I waited, barely blinking, listening as they descended the stairs. A door opened somewhere below, the hinges whining in protest. Then silence. I stayed in that corner of the room until the first light of morning crept through the window. When I finally got the courage to move, I unlocked the door carefully, peering out into the hallway. Everything looked the same. No sign that anyone had been there. I crept downstairs. The front door was closed but unlocked. The woman who ran the place was nowhere to be found. Her bedroom door was ajar, the bed neatly made, as if it hadn't been slept in. I didn't stay for breakfast. I grabbed my bag and walked out to my car. The forest was quiet, the morning air crisp. I scanned the tree line one last time. Nothing. I got in, turned the key, and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I found a cafe, sat down, and tried to make sense of what had happened. I still don't have an explanation. I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or how he got inside. I just know I won't be taking back roads through France again. It was the last winter I spent in that cabin, and I think about it more often than I'd like to admit. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quiet getaway, a break from everything before spring came and I got caught up in the rush of life again. That was the plan, at least. I had been coming to the cabin for years. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place tucked deep into the woods of northern Montana. It had been in my family for a while, passed down through a couple of generations, and I used it whenever I needed to get away. There was no electricity, no running water, just a fireplace, an old propane stove, and a hand pump outside for water. In the warmer months, it was perfect for fishing and hiking, but in the winter, it was pure isolation. That's exactly what I wanted that year. Just a few weeks of solitude, away from the noise of the world. The drive out there had been rough. Heavy snow had come early that season, making the roads difficult. I had to park my truck nearly a mile from the cabin and haul my supplies in on foot. It wasn't the first time I'd done it, but the weight of everything, food, extra firewood, propane, made the walk slow and miserable. By the time I got inside, my fingers were stiff from the cold, my back aching from the strain of dragging the sled I had loaded with my supplies. The first few days were uneventful. The snow kept falling, burying the world outside in deep silence. I spent most of my time chopping wood, melting snow for water, and reading through an old book I had brought along. Nights were long, stretching on for hours in the darkness, but I was used to it. I had been doing this for years, after all. The quiet didn't bother me, at least not at first. It started with small things. On the fourth night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't. The noise was slow and deliberate, the crunch of footsteps moving through the deep snow. I sat up, my breath visible in the cold air. I reached for the flashlight by my bed and clicked it on, but by the time I got up and looked out the window, there was nothing there. Just the trees, their branches heavy with snow, and the pale glow of moonlight stretching shadows across the ground. The next morning, I found tracks in the snow. They weren't mine. They led from the treeline, stopping a few feet from the front porch before turning back the way they came. They were deep, pressed hard into the snow, but the edges had softened overnight, making it impossible to tell how fresh they were. I stared at them for a long time, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The nearest cabin was miles away, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. Maybe it was a hunter passing through, I told myself. Someone who got turned around in the storm. But that didn't explain why they had stopped so close to the cabin. That night, I made sure the door was locked before I went to bed. The next few days, I kept an eye out, but nothing else happened. The snow kept falling, piling up against the sides of the cabin. The tracks disappeared beneath it, and I told myself I had imagined the whole thing. It was easy to do out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Then, on the seventh night, I woke up again. This time, it was different. I hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anything, but something had pulled me from sleep, an uneasy feeling curling in my stomach. The room was dark. The fire in the wood stove burned down to embers, casting faint orange light along the walls. I lay there, listening, my breath slow and shallow. Then I smelled it. Smoke, not from my stove. It was faint at first, but growing stronger. The acrid scent of burning would mixed with something else. Something off. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. When I clicked it on, I saw it immediately. The door was open, just a crack, barely enough to notice, but enough for the freezing air to slip inside. I hadn't left it open. I pulled the covers off and moved toward it, every nerve in my body on edge. I swung the door wide, shining the light outside. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the ground untouched except for a fresh set of tracks leading from the porch to the treeline. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the snow, and swung the light around. That's when I saw it. Not 20 feet from the cabin, a small fire burned low in the snow. It hadn't been there earlier. It was nothing more than a pile of half-burned sticks, but the smoke still rose from it, curling into the night air. Next to it, something lay in the snow. A rabbit. It was skinned, its body cut open, the insides dark against the white snow. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at it, my breath coming fast and sharp. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. I turned and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed what little I could onto the sled, strapping everything down as quickly as possible. The fire outside had burned down to nothing, the rabbit gone, but I didn't want to think about where it had gone. The walk back to my truck was slow, every sound in the woods making my skin crawl. When I finally reached it, I tossed my gear into the back and climbed in, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine struggled for a moment before roaring to life. I didn't waste any time. As I pulled onto the road, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Someone was standing at the edge of the trees. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any details in the dim morning light, but they were there, watching. I didn't stop. I never went back. I never expected to be alone in that cabin for as long as I was. It was my uncle's place, a small, weathered hunting cabin tucked deep into the thick forests of northern Montana. He built it back in the late 70s, long before I was born, and used it as a getaway spot, somewhere to escape, hunt, fish, and be away from people. I had only been there a handful of times growing up, but I always remembered it as a rough, no-nonsense place. There was no running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a hand pump well, and a small gas generator that he barely used. When he passed, the cabin sat untouched for years. My family didn't know what to do with it. No one wanted to sell it, but no one wanted to take care of it either. So it sat there, slowly getting swallowed by the woods. Then last year, I decided to go. I was 34, fresh off a nasty breakup, sick of my job, and tired of the city. I thought some time alone in the woods would clear my head. I wasn't planning on staying forever, just a couple of months, long enough to fix up the place and maybe do some hunting. I packed everything I thought I'd need: food, tools, ammo, extra gas for the generator. The drive took nearly 8 hours, and by the time I reached the old logging road that led to the cabin, the sun was setting. The road was worse than I remembered, deep potholes and overgrown branches scraping against my truck. When I finally got there, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged a little, the porch was covered in leaves, and the windows were thick with dust. But it was still standing. I got out, stretched my legs, and breathed in the cold, pine-scented air. It was quiet, so quiet it made my ears ring. I carried my bags inside and set up my cot near the stove. The place smelled like old wood and dust. There were cobwebs in every corner. Mice had chewed through one of the chair cushions, and the floor creaked under every step. But it was solid. The walls were thick, the locks worked, and the stove still burned hot. That first night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared, just because it was so damn quiet. I was used to city noise, cars, sirens, people. Out here, the silence was like a weight pressing down on me. Every tiny sound, the wind shifting the trees, a branch cracking in the distance, made me snap awake. By the second day, I was already falling into a routine. Wake up early, check the traps, chop wood, clean up around the cabin. I kept my rifle close, but I didn't see anything bigger than a couple of deer. At night, I'd read by lantern light or sit on the porch, listening to the woods. The first week was uneventful. The second week was when things started to change. It was small things at first. One morning, I woke up to find my axe missing. I had left it buried in the chopping block the night before, but now it was gone. I looked around, thinking maybe I had forgotten and brought it inside. Nothing. I found it later, lying about 15 feet into the trees, half buried in the dirt. I told myself it must have been an animal, a raccoon maybe. Then I started hearing noises at night. First, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't. It was faint, but I could hear something moving outside, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves. I sat up in my cot, holding my rifle, waiting. The footsteps would stop, then start again, moving around the cabin. I never saw anything. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to go outside. I took my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The trees stood still. No wind, no movement. I shined my light around but didn't see anything. Then I heard it. Something breathing. It was close, too close. A slow, deep inhale like someone trying not to be heard. I spun, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. My heart was hammering. I backed inside, locked the door, and stayed up the rest of the night. The next morning, I found footprints. Not boot prints.
Bare footprints.
Human. They circled the cabin. Some were pressed deep into the mud, meaning whoever it was had been standing there for a while, just watching. I told myself it was just some drifter, maybe a hunter who had gotten lost. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. It was the dead of winter. No one was wandering barefoot through these woods. I started keeping my rifle loaded at all times. That night, it got worse. Around midnight, I heard something new. Not footsteps scraping, like metal dragging against wood. I gripped my rifle and stayed still, listening. The sound was coming from the porch. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then, slowly, the door handle started to turn. I aimed at the door, my finger on the trigger. The handle kept twisting, but the lock held. Then the sound stopped. Silence. I waited a full minute before moving. Then, just as I was about to stand, there was a loud bang. Something slammed against the door so hard the whole cabin shook. I nearly pulled the trigger, but then, just as quickly as it started, everything went silent again. I didn't sleep. When dawn broke, I opened the door, rifle in hand. The porch was empty, but my axe was back. It was buried in the middle of the porch, blade down like someone had planted it there. I was done. I packed up everything I could carry and hiked back to my truck. As I started the engine, I glanced at the tree line one last time. That's when I saw him, a man, standing just inside the tree line, barely visible through the branches. He wasn't wearing shoes. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse and tore down that dirt road so fast I nearly lost control. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. I never went back. A few months later, my cousin drove up to check on the cabin. He called me after and asked why I had left the place unlocked. I told him I hadn't, but when he got there, the door was wide open. The inside had been ransacked. My cot was shredded, my supplies scattered, but nothing was taken. Nothing except my rifle. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I was never alone in that cabin, and neither is anyone else who goes there. I was driving through the back roads of Oregon when I saw the turnoff to Mark's old cabin. It had been years since I had been out that way, and I wasn't even sure if the place was still standing. Mark had passed away 3 years ago, a freak accident out in the woods. His family had wanted nothing to do with the cabin afterward, and from what I heard, no one had touched it since. Mark and I had grown up together. We met in middle school and had been inseparable ever since. When he bought that cabin, I spent just as much time there as he did. We hunted, fished, and drank whiskey on the porch late into the night. It was our place, our retreat from the world. And then one day he was gone. I hadn't planned on stopping. I had a long drive ahead of me, and I was already running late. But something made me slow down, made me turn onto that narrow dirt road leading into the woods. The road was rough, rutted out by years of rain and neglect. I had to take it slow, dodging potholes and fallen branches as the trees closed in around me. The deeper I went, the worse the road got. It was clear that no one had been up this way in a long time. Grass and weeds had started growing in the tire tracks. The trees leaned in from both sides, their bare branches scraping against my truck. The sun was getting low, and I told myself I would just take a quick look and be on my way before dark. I finally reached the clearing where Mark's cabin stood. The place was in bad shape. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were dark and empty. The porch was covered in leaves and broken branches. It looked abandoned, forgotten. I pulled my truck to a stop but didn't turn it off. Something about the place made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the decay. It was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. The air was still, too still. No wind, no birds, no sounds at all. I sat there for a moment, debating whether I should get out or just turn around and leave. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the trees to the front porch. I knew those prints hadn't been there long. It had rained the night before, and the ground was still soft. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they were still here. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. There was no reason for anyone to be here. The place had been abandoned for years. Mark's family hadn't been up here since his funeral. No one should have been here. I reached under my seat and pulled out my old hunting knife, just in case. Then, against my better judgment, I stepped out of the truck. The silence pressed in around me as I moved toward the cabin. The footprints led right up to the front door, but there were no signs of forced entry. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with the toe of my boot and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot. Dust hung in the beams of sunlight filtering through the broken windows. The furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, just as it should have been. But the footprints didn't make sense. Someone had walked up to the cabin, but there were no prints inside. That meant they were still out there, watching. I turned back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel eyes on me, but I couldn't see anyone. The trees stood motionless, the undergrowth undisturbed. I took a slow step onto the porch, scanning the tree line. And then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. Tall, thin, motionless. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching me. I took a step back toward my truck, keeping my eyes locked on the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I ran for my truck, my hands shaking as I yanked open the door. I didn't waste time looking back. I slammed the truck into reverse, my tires spinning in the dirt as I backed out of the clearing. As I sped down the dirt road, my mind raced. Who or what had been watching me, and why had it been standing outside Mark's cabin? I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. Even then, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the trees. I never went back to that cabin. I never spoke about what I saw, and I never, not for a single second, stopped wondering who else had been out there that night, or if they were still watching. I was 39 years old when I took the job at the cemetery. It wasn't my first choice, but after a rough couple of years bouncing between construction jobs, I needed something steady. My uncle, a man I hadn't spoken to much over the years, had worked maintenance at the cemetery on the outskirts of town for nearly 3 decades. He was retiring and put in a good word for me to take over. I figured it wouldn't be too bad. A quiet job, no boss breathing down my neck, and not many people to deal with. The cemetery wasn't massive, but it had been around for over 100 years. Rows of old headstones, some barely readable, stretched across the land, with a small section reserved for newer graves. A thin tree line bordered the far end, separating the property from the rolling hills beyond. The office was a small, old building near the entrance, where the manager worked during the day. But the real work happened at the maintenance cabin deeper inside the cemetery grounds. The cabin was a squat wooden structure, probably built back in the 50s, with a single door and 2 grimy windows. It was where tools were kept, where the riding mower was stored, and where I'd spend most of my shifts. I was hired for evening shifts, mostly handling maintenance, cutting grass, clearing branches, and checking on the fences. First, it was peaceful. The work wasn't hard. I'd ride the mower, trim the edges, collect fallen branches, and make sure everything was in order. The place emptied out after sunset, and I'd be alone, which suited me just fine. I'd sit in the cabin when I needed a break, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was quiet work, lonely, but quiet. But things started to change after a few weeks. I first noticed it one evening while finishing up some trimming near the far end of the cemetery. The sun had dipped below the hills, and the sky was that deep blue shade just before full darkness. I turned off the trimmer and stretched my arms when I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. A man, standing near the tree line. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but something about him felt off. He stood too still. The way his arms hung at his sides, the way his head was tilted just slightly, it made my stomach twist. I looked away for only a second, just to wipe sweat from my forehead, and when I looked back, he was gone. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. No movement. Just the trees swaying in the wind. It unsettled me, but I told myself it was probably a visitor who'd come in late and left. Maybe a guy taking a walk. The mind plays tricks in the dark, I reminded myself. I finished my work and walked back to the maintenance cabin. By the time I got there, night had fully settled. I put the tools away, locked up, and got in my truck to head home. As I was pulling out, I glanced back through my rearview mirror. A shadow, near the cabin. I slammed the brakes, my heart lurching into my throat. But when I turned to look properly, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep well that night. The next evening, I came in early. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was an old cemetery, my mind was playing tricks, and I wasn't used to working alone at night. But part of me wanted to check, to reassure myself. I walked the whole perimeter before my shift started, checking the fences and gates. Everything was locked up. No signs of anyone sneaking in, but something still felt wrong. As I worked, I kept feeling like I was being watched. The back of my neck prickled. I turned suddenly, expecting to see someone standing among the graves, but there was never anything there. That night, I stayed in the maintenance cabin longer than usual, trying to shake the feeling. I sat on the old wooden bench inside, listening to the hum of the wind outside. The cabin had a single overhead light, dim and flickering. The walls were lined with tools, shovels, rakes, hedge trimmers. The smell of gasoline and cut grass hung in the air. I was staring at the wall when I heard it. A noise outside, not the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They crunched against the gravel path just outside the cabin door. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped right outside. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the faintest sound of breathing. Just beyond the door, my chest tightened. I stood up as quietly as I could, reaching for the closest thing, a rusted wrench sitting on the work table. Then suddenly 3 sharp knocks. I nearly dropped the wrench. Knock, knock, knock. Hard, solid. I stared at the door. The handle didn't turn. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to get in. They just wanted me to know they were there. I took a slow step forward. My fingers tightened around the wrench. And then silence. No more knocks.
No footsteps.
Nothing. I waited, my ears straining. My own breathing sounded deafening in the quiet. After what felt like forever, I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and forced myself to open the door. The night air was cold. I swept the flashlight beam across the gravel path. Nobody. I stepped outside, heart hammering, scanning the graves, the trees, the fence line. Nothing. I should have left right then. Quit the job, never looked back. But I didn't. The next few nights were worse. The knocks came again, sometimes at the cabin door, sometimes against the metal storage shed behind it. Always 3 times, always when I was alone. One night, I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and steady, crunching against the gravel. I sat inside, wrench in hand, staring at the door, waiting for them to stop. Then, on my last night there, I saw him again. I was locking up the shed when I glanced up toward the tree line. There he was, closer this time. I could see him better now. A man tall, dressed in dark clothes. His face was hard to make out in the low light, but I saw enough. He was smiling, not a friendly smile, not a grin, a thin, stretched smile that sent ice through my veins. I stood frozen, my breath shallow. Then he took a step forward. That broke the spell. I ran. I don't remember getting into my truck. I don't remember starting it. But I remember the way my headlights washed over the graves as I sped out of there. I never went back. I quit the next morning over the phone. Didn't ask for my last paycheck. Didn't explain. Just left it behind. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I had never liked snakes. Maybe it was something about the way they moved, silent, calculating, unnatural. I had seen them before, of course. Grew up in a place where rattlesnakes coiled under porches, where water moccasins glided through the creeks like black ribbons. I knew the rules. Stay away. Watch your step. But knowing the rules doesn't always mean you get to follow them. It was early November when I arrived at the cabin. The air was colder than I expected, crisp with the promise of frost. This place wasn't mine. It belonged to my uncle, a man who had long since given up on civilization. He built the cabin out here in the woods, away from everyone because he wanted peace. That's what he told us, anyway. He hadn't been answering his phone. That wasn't unusual. He didn't like technology much, didn't trust it. But after a month of silence, my father asked me to drive out and check on him. Just see if he's okay, he had said. Maybe he just needs help with something. The drive was long, nearly 3 hours from town. Most of it spent on winding dirt roads where the trees leaned in close. I kept the radio off. There was something about the woods that made noise feel out of place. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already sinking low behind the trees. It was smaller than I remembered. The wood darkened with age, the windows smudged with dirt. His truck was parked outside, same as always. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of my car was the silence.
No birds.
No wind, just the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. I walked up to the porch, knocking twice before trying the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin smelled wrong. Stale, heavy, like old food and something else underneath it. Something I couldn't quite place. Dust floated in the last streaks of sunlight filtering through the window. The place looked normal, mostly. A few dishes in the sink, an open book on the table. But then I saw the chair knocked over near the fireplace, the dark stain on the floorboards beneath it. Something wasn't right. I stepped forward, careful, scanning the room. The stain was dry, old, but it was blood. I knew that much. I moved to the back, past the tiny kitchen, toward the bedroom. The door was shut. My fingers hesitated on the knob before turning it. The smell hit me first. Thick, sickly, rotten. My uncle was there, sprawled across the floor, his face twisted, his skin darkened and bloated. He had been dead a while. I didn't move at first, just stood there, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't make sense. He was healthy, strong for his age. No signs of a struggle, no wounds I could see, just dead. Then I heard it, a rustling, slow, deliberate. I turned my head toward the bed, toward the dark space beneath it. The sound came again, shifting, sliding. Something was under there. I backed away, careful not to step too hard, my heart hammering. And then I saw it, the snake. It was huge, bigger than any I had ever seen. Its thick body coiled in the shadow beneath the bed frame. Its skin was dark, almost black, with a dull sheen that caught the light. It moved slowly, its head lifting just slightly. That's when I saw the lump in its body, the grotesque bulge stretching the scales wide. My stomach turned. I didn't know much about snakes, but I knew enough to recognize what that meant. It had eaten something big. I didn't stay to find out what. I backed out of the room, slow, careful. The floor creaked, and the snake's head jerked slightly, its tongue flickering out. I reached the front door, stepping out onto the porch, breathing hard. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone. No service. Of course not. I had to leave, now. But something held me there, my eyes flicking back to the open doorway. My uncle was dead, had been for days. And that snake, what if? I forced the thought away, heading to my car. The keys were already in my hand when I stopped. The truck, his truck. If he had been here the whole time, then why was it parked outside? Why hadn't he driven for help? Unless I turned back toward the cabin. The setting sun cast long shadows over the porch, the doorway gaping like an open mouth. I didn't want to go back inside. Every instinct told me to leave, to drive until I hit the highway and never look back. But something inside me, maybe guilt, maybe duty, kept me rooted in place. I grabbed the flashlight from my car, flicking it on before stepping back inside. The air was thick with the stench of decay. I kept my distance from the bedroom, scanning the floor, and then I saw it, the second stain, smaller than the one near the fireplace, a few feet away, near the wall, and something else, a drag mark. My stomach clenched. There had been two bodies. I followed the trail with the flashlight, my breath shallow. It led toward the back door, the one that opened to the woods. The door was cracked open, just slightly. I pushed it wider. Outside, the ground was disturbed. Leaves scattered, dirt shifted, like something had been pulled through. I swallowed hard, shining the light forward. A shape just beyond the tree line. I stepped closer, the beam shaking, and then I saw it. Another body, not my uncle, someone else. Face down, arms stretched, shirt torn. A man. I didn't recognize him. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Who was he? And then the rustling again. Behind me, slow, deliberate. I turned just in time to see the snake. It was closer than before, its thick body sliding across the floorboards of the porch. His head lifted slightly, watching me, the bulge in its stomach. Too big for a raccoon, too big for a dog. My uncle was dead inside. That much I knew. But out here, this man, had he been alive when the snake found him? I didn't stay to find out. I ran down the steps, across the clearing, into the car. My hands fumbled with the keys, the engine stalling once before roaring to life. In the rearview mirror, I saw it just for a second. The cabin, dark and still. The door open, and the snake, its body shifting slowly, disappearing back into the shadows. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. I called the police, told them everything. They found my uncle where I left him, and the other body. They never found the snake. I never went back. I was 34 when I agreed to watch over my uncle's hunting cabin for a couple of weeks. He had owned the place for years, but I had only been there once before when I was a teenager. It sat deep in the woods, a few miles outside a small town that hardly anyone had heard of. There was no phone service, no internet, and the nearest neighbor was at least 2 miles away. He told me it would be easy. Just check the place, make sure no one had broken in, and keep an eye on things. He had a few traps set up for small game and wanted me to check them every morning. Other than that, I would be alone. I had brought enough supplies to last me the whole time. Cans of food, a couple of gallons of water, and a rifle just in case. The first couple of days were peaceful. The air was fresh. The forest around me was quiet except for the occasional rustling of animals in the brush. I spent my time reading, hiking around the property, and keeping the place tidy. At night, I would light a fire, sit on the porch, and listen to the sounds of the woods. It felt good to be away from everything. But on the third night, things started to change. I had gone to bed early, but something woke me up in the middle of the night. A noise outside. It wasn't an animal, at least it didn't sound like one. It was steady, deliberate. Footsteps. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound came from behind the cabin, where the forest was thick. I reached for my rifle, listening. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. I waited, heart pounding, straining my ears for any sign of movement. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it had been my imagination. The woods could play tricks on you at night. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. I didn't see anything at first, but when I walked around the back, I saw them. Footprints. They were human. They led from the tree line to the back of the cabin and then stopped, just a few feet from the wall. It was like whoever had made them had stood there for a while before turning back. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw no sign of anyone. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had wandered too close, but I knew that was unlikely. The nearest trail was miles away, and this wasn't the kind of place people just stumbled upon. That night, I locked the doors and kept my rifle close. Just after midnight, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard something moving in the brush, the snapping of twigs, the sound of someone breathing. Came closer, slow and steady. I held my breath, gripping the rifle. Then I heard a light tap on the window. It was soft, almost hesitant. A single knock, then another. I stayed completely still. Whoever was outside didn't knock again. They just stood there. I couldn't see them, I didn't want to move the curtain, but I could feel them there, watching. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard the footsteps retreating, fading into the trees. The rest of the night was silent. The next morning, I checked the area again. More footprints. This time, they were right up against the cabin. They had circled the building, stopping at each window. Someone had been watching me. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept the rifle with me at all times. Every noise in the woods made my skin crawl. The quiet that I had enjoyed just days ago now felt oppressive. That night, I didn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard something new. The door handle moved. It wasn't subtle. Whoever was outside was trying to open the door. Slowly, carefully. I held my breath, heart pounding. Then the knocking started again. Soft, deliberate, just like the night before. I raised the rifle, pointing it at the door. The knocking stopped. Then a long silence. And then the footsteps walking away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed my things. I had agreed to stay for 2 weeks, but I knew I wouldn't last another night. I locked up the cabin, loaded my gear into my truck, and started the long drive back to town. As I left the woods behind, a sense of relief washed over me. But then, just as I was about to merge onto the highway, I looked at the side mirror. There, on the edge of the woods, half hidden behind the trees, was a figure, standing still, watching me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. And my uncle, when I told him what happened, just shook his head, said he had never seen anything strange out there. Maybe he hadn't, but I know what I saw, and I know that something or someone had been watching me in those woods. And whoever they were, they had wanted to get inside. I don't go into the woods alone anymore, and I never will. I never thought much about the old cabin in the woods. It had been sitting there long before I was born, tucked deep into the forest behind my grandfather's old property. My grandfather used to mention it every now and then, always in passing, just a vague warning to stay away, something about it being abandoned for decades. I never asked questions. As a kid, the woods were my playground, but that cabin was the one place I never ventured near. Years passed. My grandfather passed away, and the property was left to me. By then, I was 36, living in the city, barely even thinking about that land anymore. But life has a way of pushing you back to places you've long left behind. A job loss, a messy breakup. I needed an escape, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from people. The old property seemed perfect. So, I packed up my things and moved into the small house that had once belonged to my grandfather. It was simple but solid, sitting just at the edge of the forest. The air was cleaner out there. The silence was heavy but peaceful. I spent my days fixing up the place, clearing out old junk, making it feel like my own. But the cabin was always in the back of my mind. It wasn't far, just about a 20-minute walk into the woods. The path leading to it was overgrown, barely visible under years of fallen leaves and tangled branches. I told myself I wouldn't go near it. I had no reason to. It was just an old, forgotten structure, probably falling apart. Then, one afternoon, I saw something strange. I had been out chopping wood behind my house when I noticed movement deeper in the woods. Just a flicker, something shifting between the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, but then I saw a shape tall, human. Someone was standing out there, half hidden in the shadows. I froze, gripping the axe a little tighter. Nobody else lived out here. The closest neighbor was miles away. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching. An older man, maybe in his 60s, thin but not frail. He was wearing dark clothes, a jacket that looked worn out, and a hat pulled low over his face. Something about him felt off. I didn't call out to him. Instead, I turned and walked back toward the house, keeping him in my peripheral vision. He never moved, just stood there watching me until I was inside. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise outside made my skin crawl. The woods had always felt peaceful to me, but now they felt like they were closing in. The next day, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just a hiker who got lost. But a part of me knew that wasn't the case. Nobody came out this far. A few days passed without incident. Then, one evening, I found something strange near the edge of my property. Footprints. Deep, heavy footprints in the dirt, leading from the woods toward my house. They stopped just a few yards from my back door. I checked around the house, but nothing was missing or disturbed. It was like someone had just walked up, stood there for a while, and left. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was the same man. That night, I stayed up late, keeping watch through the window. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, I saw movement again. The man. He was standing at the tree line, closer this time. He didn't do anything. Didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, watching. Something in me snapped. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, aiming the beam toward him. The second the light hit him, he turned and disappeared into the woods, moving fast for someone his age. I didn't chase him. I didn't want to know where he went, but I knew where he had come from. The cabin. The next morning, I made up my mind. I had to see it for myself. The hike to the cabin was harder than I remembered. The forest felt thicker, the air heavier. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. When I finally saw the cabin, my stomach twisted. It looked worse than I imagined. Half collapsed, roof caving in, walls warped from years of neglect. But someone had been there. I could see footprints leading up to the door, fresh ones, pressed deep into the dirt. I stepped closer. The door was slightly open. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Old furniture, broken glass, papers scattered everywhere. But there were signs of recent activity. Empty food cans, a dirty blanket in the corner. Someone had been living here. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pinned to the wall just above the blanket were photographs. Dozens of them. All of me. Pictures of me chopping wood. Walking near my house. Even one of me sleeping, taken through my window. I backed out of the cabin, heart pounding, trying to keep my breathing steady. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Someone was coming. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs nearly gave out. When I reached my house, I locked every door, every window. Then I grabbed my shotgun and sat there, waiting. The man never came. The next morning, I drove straight into town and went to the police. They sent a deputy out to check the cabin. When he came back, he told me something that made my skin crawl. The cabin was empty. No photos, no blanket, no signs that anyone had ever been there. But the footprints were still there, leading up to my house. I didn't stay after that. I packed my things and left. I don't know who that man was or why he was watching me. I don't want to know. All I know is that sometimes, late at night, I still get the feeling that someone is watching. And I never go near old cabins anymore. The rain had started falling just after sunset. It was the kind of rain that soaked everything in an instant, the heavy, endless kind that made the air thick and cold. The forecast had called for light showers, but this was a full-blown storm. The trees swayed violently, and the wind howled as if trying to rip them from the ground. I could hear the raindrops hammering against the roof of the cabin, a steady, unrelenting noise that filled the space like white noise. I had come here to spend the weekend alone. The cabin belonged to my uncle, an old hunting lodge deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest paved road. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden structure with a single bedroom, a kitchen, and a main living area. No television, no internet, just an old radio that crackled with static when I turned it on. There was a fireplace, but I hadn't bothered lighting it yet. I had driven up in the afternoon, my truck now parked outside, half hidden by the trees. The moment I stepped out of the vehicle, I knew I had made a mistake. The air was damp, the kind that seeps into your bones, and the woods felt different. I had been here before plenty of times, but something about it felt off this time. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was just my imagination, but the quiet wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that made you uneasy, like something was watching. I shook off the feeling and carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and damp air, the way it always did when it had been left empty for a while. I checked the pantry and found a few canned goods left over from my uncle's last visit, enough to get me through the weekend if I needed it. I had brought my own supplies anyway: coffee, bread, a few packs of dried food. By the time the rain started, I had settled in. I sat in the chair near the window, watching the storm roll in through the trees. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes, and the darkness outside became absolute. No stars, no moon, just the black outline of trees shifting in the wind. The sound of the rain was constant, a steady drumming that should have been comforting. But as I sat there, something about it started to bother me. It took me a while to realize what it was. The storm was loud, but underneath it, just barely, I could hear something else. A different sound, something that didn't belong. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the brush. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't either of those things. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps. I sat perfectly still, my heart pounding, straining to hear past the rain. It was impossible to tell exactly where the sound was coming from. The storm distorted everything, making it feel like the world outside was shifting, alive in its own way. But I was sure of one thing: whatever it was close. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining it through the window. The beam cut through the rain, lighting up the trees in pale yellow. Nothing, just the woods, wet and empty. The moment the light hit the tree line, the sound stopped. I held my breath. I waited. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, I turned off the flashlight. For a long time, I stayed where I was, listening, waiting to hear it again. But all I could hear was the rain, the wind, the creaking of the cabin as it shifted in the cold. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing, just a trick of the storm. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up, startled by the smallest sounds. The wind against the walls, the branches tapping against the window, my own breathing, loud in the silence. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, and something was different. The rain had stopped. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the storm. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The cabin felt smaller in the dark, the walls closer than before. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. They were closer now. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my throat. The sound was coming from just outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, moving around the perimeter. Someone or something was circling the building. I reached for the flashlight again, gripping it tight. My hands were sweating. I told myself to be rational, to think. Could be an animal, a deer maybe, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I stood up as quietly as I could and moved toward the window, barely breathing. I didn't turn on the light this time. Instead, I pressed my face close to the glass and tried to see through the darkness. There was nothing there. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I felt my whole body tense, waiting for something to happen. The wind had died down, the trees barely moving. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and heavy in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, something scraped against the wooden wall of the cabin. I jumped back, my stomach twisting. The sound was slow, deliberate, like nails dragging against the wood. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. My uncle kept a rifle in the cabin. I had seen it earlier, propped against the corner near the fireplace. I moved toward it carefully, my movements slow and controlled. I grabbed the rifle and checked the chamber. loaded. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the noise started again. But this time it was at the door. A low, creaking sound, like weight pressing against the wood. The handle rattled once, then went still. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door. My breathing was shallow, my arms tense. The seconds dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours. Then nothing. No more sounds. No more movement. I stayed there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. The storm had left everything soaked, the air thick with moisture. But outside, whoever had been there was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the rain had started again, lighter this time. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the wet earth. I checked around the cabin, searching for footprints. The ground was soft, muddy. If someone had been walking around, there would be signs. I found them, footprints, deep and clear, circling the cabin. They weren't mine. I didn't wait to find out who had made them. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and left. I never told my uncle what happened. I never went back. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone.